Jung is the person we're going to talk about today and next time. And I'm going to talk about him in some ways indirectly, because the best way to understand Jung is to show you what you do with his ideas rather than really presenting the ideas themselves. But I can give you a bit of an overview. So, one of the things that differentiates the depth psychologists from, say, behavior therapists, and even from cognitive scientists, is that you might say in one way they're more mystical, which means more from the romantic tradition than the cognitive scientists and the behaviorists. So there's a temperamental split there, eh? Because people who are high in openness, and both Freud and Jung were very, very high in trait openness, are very interested in the domain of the imagination and the domain of fantasy, because they have very active imaginations and they have very active fantasy lives, and they're good visualizers. And so one of the things I've noticed in my clinical practice, there's always been a joke about depth psychologists, that if you go see a Freudian, you have Freudian dreams, and if you go see a Jungian, you have Jungian dreams. And I suppose that means if you go to a behavior therapist that you don't have any dreams at all. But I actually think there's some truth in that, because the more pragmatic people, the more practical people, are not going to be attracted to therapists who deal with issues that have to do, say, with the imagination or fantasy. And so there's a natural parsing. And one of the things I've noticed in my clinical practice is that imaginative people, so those would be open and creative people, have a dream life that cries out to be interpreted in archetypal terms. Like, I've had clients, a number of them now. I have one right now. I mean, his dream life is so rich, it's remarkable. He's a genius dreamer. Every time he comes in, there's like he has 2 dreams or 3 dreams. They're coherent, they're complexly plotted, they're interesting, and they chart what's going on in his life, and they tell him what he should do. It's like, it's great. But everyone isn't like that. I also have clients who never dream at all. And then I've also seen when I've lectured to people, and I see this most particularly in medical students, because I've lectured a bit to medical students, is like, so maybe I'll do a seminar for the medical students and tell them a little bit about the symbols of transformation, really, because they're involved in, first of all, transforming, because they're medical students, and so you have to transform them to a doctor, and also, of course, they're helping people through transformations all the time, often negative, but not always, sometimes positive, because sometimes you get better. And so it's useful, possibly, for them to understand those processes more deeply. Generally, with the medical school students, I do half lecture that's more on like trait psychology and more behavioral, and half of it on the more symbolic stuff, which is kind of like this class is. And there's always about half the medical students on whom the more symbolic stuff just falls flat. They just don't. It's like talking about color to people who are colorblind. And I've thought about this a lot, and I really do think it's based in temperamental differences. So, you know, if you have an active fantasy life, and you have an active imagination, and you're a good visualizer, and you dream a lot, then that's the sort of person you are. And if you're on the other end of the scale, which would be that you're very conscientious, let's say, and very low in openness, which also tends to make you more conservative in your political presuppositions, by the way, then dream analysis is probably not for you, partly because you're just not going to come up with that many dreams. And even if you do, they won't necessarily be informative. So, you know, there's been a very long battle in some ways in the psychological and psychiatric community between people who take different perspectives on how you might address psychological problems. But I don't know if the issue of type has been thought about seriously enough in that regard, because we're really only starting to understand the dimensions, the actual dimensions of personality properly, and to figure out what it means to be on one end of, say, openness and versus the other one. Especially if you're intelligent. You can be intelligent, not open. Those are complicated people. They've got very analytical minds. They make good lawyers. Like, lawyers are often, and this is something you might think about if you're planning to become a lawyer. If you're high in openness, it's a bad job for you. You will not be happy. You need to be really conscientious, like off the scale. And it helps to be disagreeable too. So, because if you're too agreeable, well, you're supposed to win if you're a lawyer. You're not supposed to, like, nicely let the other person win. You know, you're supposed to fight to win. And so you have to be kind of fighty to do that. And if you're high in agreeableness, then it's a job that's kind of grates against your temperament. So anyways,